Thank you for joining and for lending me your time and attention for the next hour. As you may know, AI is a big thing today, right? And as the title might have given up, we will be talking about AI. Right? We will talk about its impact, especially on ourselves as humans, on our processes as developers, right? Uh, and at the end, we're going to touch on a couple of topics on how to leverage the benefits of adopting a tool, right? Because in the end, it's a tool without falling in the pitfalls and risks that adopting a tool tends to provide, right? And when I talk about a tool, think about a drill, right? You usually don't use a drill to hurt yourself or others, right? It has a specific functionality regardless of the danger it might entail if not used properly. But before we jump into that set of topics, right? Let me show you a quote that you probably have seen around the while lately. As I was mentioning, we will be talking about AI, right? But before we jump into specifically the AI tooling and the practices and sensible defaults that we can set around it to make sure us and our teams leverage them in the best possible way without falling into the risks and dangers, right, of new tooling, let's talk about a couple of contextual things before, right? And first off, showing you this quote that I'm sure you've seen around in the internet or on YouTube videos or on people talking about how AI will be transformative, right? Which is something I believe too. It will be transformative. But I also think this quote is a bit dramatic, but also not as powerful as it should be, right? I added a bit of spice to it. I think AI won't replace us, definitely, as humans. It will do some of the jobs that humans do currently, mostly the mechanical ones, right? Or the ones that are statically analysis of data with an output, which is what generative AI excels at. But I think that this quote should be better with this added onto it, right? AI won't replace us directly, or at least not this year. Another human using AI intentionally and responsibly will, right? Because it's not just about using AI, right? Many companies think that having a GitHub license for their teams, it's their AI strategy, and it shouldn't stop there, right? And we will be talking about that in a moment. As Daniel already mentioned, my name is Arturo Mosqueda Chavez. I'm from Mexico, from Guadalajara. I've been a systems engineer for the best part of the last 2 decades. And for the past 5, I've been a technical director at Improving, right? Which has, of course, given me a lot of chances to work side by side and also overview sometimes several teams, a myriad of teams building several products with different architectures, with different levels of maturity, right? I've seen many teams adopt tooling. I've been part of it as well, and I'm sure you have been as well. And of course, I can list a lot of things down here, right? But I'm going to limit it because we're not talking about me here. I'm also a father of an amazing daughter. I'm a gamer and reader of many things. I am a human, which is quite important in these days. And I'm also an avid AI user for a while. I have been, right? Way before generative AI, probably. If you've ever developed video games, you probably are an avid AI user. Even if you have played them, you have faced AI before. But just to make sure we are talking about the same topic, the AI we'll be talking about today is generative AI specifically, right? The big name in today's industry. So now, to get into the topic at hand, let me share with you 3 stories from my personal life, from my experience in the industry, right? That I think encapsulate very well the foundational context for the talk. First off, the mnemonics of phone numbers. I'm sure many of you know where I'm heading with this, but once upon a time, humans had to memorize phone numbers, and they used it to dial other people. Some of you might remember that. And it was kind of commonplace, right? To keep in your memory the phone numbers of 5, 10, 15 people, right? Not all people had cell phones back then. You had to memorize the landlines of your grandparents, of your siblings if they went away of the home, anything, right? And I myself prided on my skill, or gained pride on my skill of memorizing this. I was really into mnemotechnic strategies, right? Like the mental palace or associating memories to sensations, that type of thing. But I do remember the exact time where I lost the skill or the capability of memorizing phone numbers, right? Or I guess my mind didn't think it was important enough to keep memorizing them, right? I was in high school. I just received my first cell phone, which was, as you can see in the image, a Motorola flip phone. There were already better phones back in the day. There were phones with cameras, but that's what I got back then. The one thing, and probably the first thing I did with it, was dump all of the phone numbers and contact information, right? Because it's not just phone numbers, it's also birth dates, right? It's addresses, its relations. Who is this man's wife, right? Which name should I memorize of these people if I want to keep in a relationship with them? I dumped it all into my cell phone, and it wasn't more than a week, right, before I got asked again for a number. Because it usually happens, right? You delegate memories to other people. We'll be talking about that in a moment, and depend usually on them to retrieve that information, like phone numbers. If you have a partner, probably your children's doctor's or professor's name, that type of thing, right? And I recall perfectly because I, again, used to have a lot of pride on my memory, right? I love memorizing things in general. I memorized a lot of rap lyrics back in the day. I memorized the first 250 Pokemons, right? Things like that. But when I realized I wasn't able to retrieve a piece of information that I probably have tapped 100 of times before, right? Which was my grandmother's cell phone. I realized something was weird, right? And at the time, I just delegated that to, it's probably me growing up. But there was definitely a curtain before and after digital devices enabled us to store information, right? The next story that I will talk to you about is about a team, a recent story. About 7 years ago, we started with a healthcare company, back in the day, a healthcare startup. And we helped them build their product, which provides services for mature people obtaining medical services, right? But this team had a very peculiar thing, right? Usually here at Improving, we tend to accompany our customers to mature to a level of understanding and practice on the agile frameworks or whichever framework you're using for the development, the tracking of tasks, the planning of product to production, right? But these customers, especially the CEO, categorically didn't want any of those processes in his project, right? He had a very strict goal of about 9 months to release. He had his own method and his own system. And the team adopted it pretty much in weeks, or probably after a month, right, of being in the project. We, of course, had the advantage that most of the engineers assigned on the project were very senior. Like they were already familiar with flexibility and adaptability on every new project, right? But the weird thing here is that they didn't have any tools. They didn't follow Waterfall. They didn't follow Scrum. They were their own board, pretty much, right? They were their own project tracking system. And each one of them had pieces of the project in their heads, and all of the team knew about it, right? Like all of the team members knew who the expert was on a certain thing. And don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting this pattern. This is definitely not sustainable in the long run. But what was interesting here was that this team in 9 months actually delivered a very solid product with very good architecture without the need, right, of an artifact or device to visually track stories, which if you ask me right now, for me, even though I did that probably in my first years in the industry, it's just surreal, right? But in the end, it was a viable system. They shipped to production. They have been in the market for a while. They have grown a lot, right? All from that little effort of human interaction. The meeting-driven memory was actually something that the CEO back then mentioned, right? Like, I don't want people to delegate the ownership of the product to a board. I want that during our meetings, during our interactions, everyone owns a piece of it, right? Again, not sustainable. The moment they launched to production, they added a new engineer, and that was a trigger for the team to figure out they needed to move to a more standardized, a more structured approach to software development, right? The final story that I want to talk to you about, right, was sort of manager that I had on one of my last projects a couple of years ago. First off, this company was going through a big transformation, right? The moment we arrived, and we were a team of 5 people, I think, from Mexico, and there were many new developers as well hired in the US. They pretty much refreshed their whole team, right? Only 2 engineers from the original team were still there. They were moving from waterfall and legacy practices to a very strict and I will say very strict agile methodology, right? Many people were added to this project. Like we grew from 5 to about 30 in a matter of months. And they had this metric called mean time to production, right? Where pretty much their goal was to make sure that any new engineer onboarded to the project could send stuff to production with a good understanding of the system, which was a gigantic microservice architecture, the sooner they could, right? And they actually did. They keep growing. They keep adding people from offshore and nearshore and internally. And I think, well, I don't think, I'm certain that the winning strategy here was single-handedly driven by our engineering manager back then. this engineering manager had a very hard track record, right? Like she have coded for companies here in the US, in America, in Europe, in everywhere. She had experienced a lot of teams as well, a lot of problems, both in people problem solving as well as in technical problem solving, right? But the strategy she introduced was pretty much a base of knowledge, right? She was our curator for information. Every decision, every trade-off, every technical document that we produced, she indexed it very carefully. She indexed it on our Confluence page, right? And this may sound very dumb, but by making that memory offload to a knowledge base that you can actually rely on, right, made a whole difference for the engineering team, right? An engineering team powered by very fast CI/CD processes. Like on the hit on the button, you could get your stuff to staging, and then if you get approved on a hit of another button, you could get to production, right? Their culture was fail fast, learn fast. Let's get stuff up there. Let's make sure our users are seeing new features, right? They did a lot of A/B experimentation. It was amazing. Then again, that piece of offloading what usually as an engineer you keep in your head or in your notes all the time in a centralized space, very organized, very indexed, so you could just search. Okay, let's see how our Cypher method looks like, right? Let's see how we decide on new integrations, how we onboard new customers, etc. So the takeaway from this couple of stories, right? First of is that our memory is in a hard drive, right? We don't usually pick data points in our brain and immediately get a full video with photographic memory that reveals to us what happened, right? On the past couple of decades, actually, as a species, right, the technology has evolved enough to let us know that our memory is mostly a compound, right? Or the memories that we recall are a composition of several factors, not just one data point. And the strength actually that we form to bond memories that are not everlasting, right? But at least last long enough for them to be remembered when they are relevant, have to do with everything around the subject at hand, right? Not just the memory itself. When I'm studying, probably the music that I'm listening, probably the heat that I'm feeling or the cold that I'm feeling, several factors might involve in how much can I store that information in my brain accurately, right? So from the story that I mentioned, we've already seen an example of cognitive offloading, right? Which is, again, when you have a lot of stuff in your mind, and especially when that stuff needs to be shared among a group of people, it's great to have a device, right? Before we had devices, we used to do that with other people, right? Which leads me to the next topic, which is transactive memory. There's this transactive memory theory that mentions that in groups of individuals, and lately with devices as well, groups tend to naturally form these bonds, right? Where you store information in someone else and know how to retrieve it from that individual, right? Again, a very common example is couples that have children, right? The ideal will be that everyone is aware of the state of school, the state of affairs at the house, the state of affairs in the medical conditions of every member of the family, right? But it's been studied that oftentimes, and this might be given to very in-depth gender roles in our society, right? But also in how we have agreed as a society to store information. You know? Most people rely on the spouse or the husband, right, to manage one aspect of the household management, right, of the family management, which usually ends up in fun scenarios. It is a hard drive. This is also not a term that's new. This is not something that occurred to me, and I didn't woke up saying, hey, I'm going to talk about this and win a Nobel Prize. Sadly for me, this has been studied and researched for a while now, right? Again, for a big part of the last 2 decades as well. It has been named with different names and for different reasons, right? But there's definitely a correlationship between how we use technology in terms of store and retrieve information and how we adapt our mental processes and cognitive processes to memorize and utilize that information, right, for problem solving and decision taking. The term Google effect was coined at the beginning of the last decade as well, right, which is mostly related to people not remembering facts anymore because it's easier to just Google them, right? Now, I do have to disclose that from the several studies that I read about it and several papers, which are still being published today, there's still research going on. I mean, I think none of them are as impactful, right? Mainly because the initial studies in 2007 were used a group of about 1,000 people, right? Which is a big population, but it might not indicate an actual reflection of society being affected by this, right? In latest studies, that number has grown to about from 17,000 in some studies to 30,000 in some studies, and especially with the internet, right, and the super connectivity that we have now, it involving several parts of our world, right? But still a Google effect, even if it's not scientifically proven, I will say, or with a big enough population to make an impact globally, as environmental change should as well. It's certainly something that I live and I experience, and the many people that I've talked with about this topic seem to have experienced at least a fraction of this, right? As part of this studies, one of the biggest things that I got is that most people, the majority of people, 61%, at least in 2019, didn't need to remember facts, right? Like they didn't have that necessity at all to remember facts. And especially, I drove this little survey with engineers close to me, with about 100 engineers. And it's about the same thing, right? You need to memorize syntax, you need to memorize the functions in your code, right? And it has been a decreasing number through the years, right? How we, as humans and even as IT professionals, understand, right, how important it is to memorize things, or to just memorize where to fetch that thing we memorized the best, right? The latest study, by the way, to 2024, there was an Indian neurologist with a team that actually studied this on this 30,000 people group. And they have certainly found a decrease, right, on how many people memorize the phone numbers of their siblings, right? From about 16% to 51% people not memorizing anymore their siblings' phone number. And it kind of makes sense, right? I'm not saying this is a bad thing. I think it's natural that us as humans create tools to reduce our mental effort or physical effort to something, and then we simply drop that in favor of new things, right? Probably new, more valuable things that we can do. Writing. So going back to the term tools, right? Remember that in the end, AI is a tool. And as any tool, if used unchecked, it might provide things different than benefits. Going back to the example of a drill, right? If you use a drill to put a hole in your TV, it's probably not the best usage, right? You can use it for it. But if you use it properly, you will finally hang that mirror that's been there for several months now. It's a tool in the end, right? And now going back to quotes that we have seen a lot lately, you have probably seen this one, right? This is part of the Agile Manifesto, if you don't recognize it. And this is very true. It will keep true like forever, probably, even after the AI age, especially because of what we actually do as engineers, right? Which is not coding in the end. Coding is the smallest piece of our actual effort during creating a system, creating a software product. Most of the work is actually on the interactions, right? It's on either on the isolated efforts of abstraction and mental processing, or actually discussing and agreeing with people, right? Understanding the problem we are solving, figuring out and debating about the solution we are about to deliver, right? And also something important about this quote and the Agile Manifesto is that the people that signed off on it weren't just random project managers, right? Like, weren't people that didn't know about what was going on. It was the very own Uncle Bob Martin, right? It was the creators of extreme programming, the authors of the pragmatic programmer, right? The people who coined the term technical dev, like people who were very much in the bleeding edge of the evolution of the processes that we've been developing for decades now to optimize our human act of software creation, pretty much, right? So starting to move into the AI world, we're still thinking about this as a tool, right? And we've seen this behavior in humankind, mostly on the industry, but now humankind, because AI is mainstream, it's trending, it's on the news everywhere, right? But at least in the industry, we've seen this behavior a few times in the past, right? You might remember when we were moving to the cloud, thanks to AWS and their Amazon Web Services around 2006, 2007. There was a promise, right? Like companies actually thought that they will be able to ditch their sysadmins. Oh, one head less, headcount less cost. That's cool. But what actually happened was that the sysadmin role evolved to a very more complex, more expensive DevOps role, right? You probably didn't have to do many stuff in Perl or in your HTTP files to make sure you're routing correctly, but now you have to do that on the cloud environment, right? Autocomplete. This one is actually quite heavy because it has happened to me as well. I interviewed a plethora of engineers through the months, right? Several engineers from different levels, different maturity points on their careers, and it's kind of expected to me that most of them default during the interview, which it usually has a code challenge uh, portion in the very end. Most engineers usually default to their tooling, right? They try to autocomplete stuff. They try to tap their way while writing on the editor that I provide for them. But this editor, of course, doesn't have many features, right? It's just an IDE with some IntelliSense and color coding for the language that you choose to interview on. But what really baffles me is that most senior engineers, like the junior engineers, don't have this problem as much, but most senior engineers take a lot of time to actually fall back to a moment where they don't need the tool, where they don't need autocomplete. And it's usually at that point where I just let them Google for stuff, right? Because they forget functions, they forget syntax, right? Which if you were coding 20 years ago, you probably know that syntax was, that was king, right? Another example of this that ended out here on the slide is UI UX drag and drop platforms, right? That's another promise of we don't need more engineers that make the UI. But wait, you still need people that understand how to actually design an application for real users, right? With accessibility and usability considered. You actually need people to connect whatever you produce in a UI drag and drop platform to your data sources, to your services, right? And with generative AI, I'm seeing the same situation, right? But I think this time is potentiated or powered by media, by misinformation, right? There's another quote that I like that AI is probably the fastest growing and the most misunderstood technology that we've seen in 30 years or more that we've been doing web scale stuff, right? Now, there's definitely a lot of value in this AI promise, right? I've seen it create value for people, reduce the time that they spend on certain tasks, right? I've seen teams gather around an agreement that took them sometimes weeks, right? Or a full quarterly big room planning to get in line with by using AI-powered product ownership tools, right? With AI. But there's definitely a value there. You can also use them for insights that as a human, you can produce, right? By several acts like static analysis, estimation, right? Pondering. But having an assistant, right? A tool that is an assistant, adding value has a lot to do with how you request that value, how you input pretty much the context for whatever comes out of that pipe to be valuable for you, right? And a couple of places where I've seen this happen, right? And in both sides of the coin, in a very terrible way with very bad expectations, and in a very intentional way with a very good outcome, are again in product process tooling, right? Product ownership, planning tools, estimation tools, also wireframe to code, which this is usually a very tough topic with customers that are not as technical savvy, but are very drenched in the AI hype, right? Because there's still no magic way to simply click a button and get your Figma UI wireframe into a perfectly integrated React component, something like that. And I also seen it a lot used on the human side of things, right? I don't think I have met someone yet who is dating an AI agent. Hopefully I don't, because I have a lot of jokes for that. But there's definitely a lot of people using it for therapy and companionship, right? And that's also extrapolated into the professional realm, right? There's people using it as mentors for new languages that they want to learn. There's people using them as their product owners for product that they want to build, right? Using the tool in the end isn't bad at all. The way you formulate your intent, I think, for yourself and then for the large language model has a lot to do with how much value you get out of it, right? But finally, there's definitely risks, right? And me, in my risk-oriented mindset, listed a bunch of the risks that I see today, but honestly, I summarize them into the erosion of memory, right? What we were talking about earlier, telephones, I can't memorize telephones anymore. I've seen engineers lose the ability to problem solve as they did, right? Even me, if you remember, I've been a technical director for 5 years, and the first year, I took a sidestep from the technical learning and daily 24/7 coding and debugging and problem solving, right? And engaging with customers in that regard to make sure I could obtain the skill sets for creating an organic organization, right? To make sure we could scale, to make sure people were happy with their jobs. And that year, it's all it took to make me realize that coding is not like riding a bicycle, right? Because coding, again, is not just coding. It's the whole muscle of pattern recognition, right? Of problem analysis, of even communicating in a technical lingo with others, right? It has a lot to do with how much we practice and how much we memorize, right? How our cognitive process solidified our experience during that time to make sure we can recall it afterwards somewhat accurately. And this also gives me another important topic to talk about, right? Which will be my segue to the practices and sensible defaults we'll be talking in a moment. Writing code isn't really what developers do, right? And again, probably writing code by itself could be something you can delegate to an AI, right? Given the proper input. But the whole work that goes behind it, right? The whole abstraction process, it's either an individual or a collaborative group activity, right? Is what actually makes engineering so fun, first of all, and also so valuable, right? Because to solve an actual problem, you need to analyze several verticals, right? And AI tooling is getting there. It's certainly useful to at least let you know or make you aware of all of the verticals you need to analyze a problem from, right? Or all of the filters you need to add to make sure that you're not biased by some previous experience. But still, one of the importances of the important tasks, I think, for engineering managers, directors, even individuals that have software as part of their lives, right, is understanding the granularity of your skill expression, right? Like what do we actually do as engineers, right? What exactly is my value when I'm coding something, when I'm thinking about a problem, when I'm presenting a solution, right? Because in the end, software does require not just the code. It requires deep contextual knowledge, right? Which you usually get through conversations with product experts, with reading a lot about the matter at hand, right? And interviewing subject matter experts. You need to obtain context, right? And as engineers, we eventually become expert witnesses of many industries and many businesses, right? And it also requires continuous collaboration. Yes, you can build software by yourself. I think Minecraft was built by a single individual, and there's many proofs of that, right? But then again, even collaborating with yourself is a requirement in those cases. If you have ever started a project by yourself, you understand that you need to be your product manager. You need to be your own tyrant and your own counselor. And sometimes, right, you're in the end collaborating with different facets of yourself as a human, as an engineer, right? So collaboration is required, right? And AI, even though we can plug it to many things with new patterns that are coming up, like MCPs from Anthropic, right? Still need context, right? It still will require to understand what you understand to make sure that it gives you an output as you expected, right? As informed as you expected. And in this case, I want to make a pause, right? To name one more keyword that we've been seeing a lot, I'm sure, everywhere in the web, which is agentic. And if you can write in the chat, I'm not sure if you can write in the chat, but if you can write in the chat, write down what your guess of agentic, what agentic means, right? In this or any context. But agentic or agentic systems, at the beginning, I was very certain, and probably because of the language barrier, that it meant agents, right? AI agents doing stuff for me. But agentic actually comes from a Latin word, right? Which means agency, which is the capability for someone, and lately something, well, not so lately, but someone or something to act independently and achieve outcomes by self-driven actions, right? Pretty much the capability of doing stuff by yourself. And this applies to, again, people and things, right? AI agents, ideally, should be agentic, and they will be at some point. But one of the truths that I realized and I've seen, at least in the current state of the technology, is that AI tooling is not ready yet to work unsupervised, at least not fully unsupervised. Hence, we still need to work and reinforce, exercise the muscle of agency as humans. Okay, and this is where the risk and the opportunity collide, right? We can definitely leverage a lot of our menial tasks to a machine. We've been doing that for ages now. But this exercise of also understanding what value we're adding, the specifics, the granularity of it, will help us understand which parts of what we do are actually menial tasks that anyone can do. And this is hopefully not despective to any junior developer, but it's usually what you do with junior developers. Like, okay, this is something I've done 100 times in my career. I don't want to write another e-commerce front page anymore. Juniors can do it, right? Understanding what you do, what value you do add, helps you delegate better, right? And especially because delegating has a cost for you, right? It will have a cost that you can sort of solve by adding oversight to whatever you're delegating. But delegation has a cost of context for you, right? You start losing in-depth touch with the context of whatever you're delegating, because it's something you're offloading from your brain and your responsibility set to something or someone else, right? And some of the specific core skills that I will categorically tell you to protect, right, in your human teams and in yourselves, right, are specifically on engineering, are these five, right? First up, problem-solving heuristics. Like what are the patterns that you either learned from books and people, or that you have by experience converted into mental models that you recall during your problem-solving process? Your pattern recognition, which is very human, right? And I think this specific point is one where we interact a lot and we can collaborate a lot with an AI tool. It's mostly the identification of patterns, right? Either on data or in code, right? Understanding patterns is a very human, very monkey-like feature of our human container. And the next one is debugging strategies, right? Debugging is something that AI can also start doing. I've seen some systems that incorporate AI processes in their observability engine, in Datadog and that kind of stuff. And they certainly help you pinpoint the problem better, right? But right now, especially with complex systems in a world where microservices are also everywhere, right? And probably the context limit of many large language models isn't enough to contain everything that it needs to know for you to solve something. Still does require some human sleuthing, right? And again, it doesn't mean that none of this should involve AI. You can use AI as an assistant, but these are tasks that human oversight is still key to be performed correctly, accurately, without risks, without damage afterwards, or reworking on things, right? System thinking as well, right? If you have heard about systems thinking or systems mind models, it's mostly how we accommodate a specific knowledge, right? And a specific processes in our mind to get to a result, an abstract result, usually faster, right? It's something that we think AI does, but as many of you know, because I see many technical individuals here, what AI is doing in the background is just guessing. Right? It's a guessing game. It's not really thinking or creating mental models for it. And finally, collaboration patterns, right? As you heard from two of the stories that I mentioned, right? Both of those teams work very differently for their projects. And what I've seen as part of a service company for a decade is that every project is a new beginning, right? It's a new day at school. Every team, even if a team has collaborated before, every team in a new project is a new team and goes through a new maturity model all the way, right? Through forming the team, to figuring out their problems and conflicts, and getting to the other side of them with agreements and understanding how to actually work together, and giving and receiving feedback, becoming natural, that type of thing, right? Those patterns are also something that we cannot automate yet. We probably won't in a few years, right? But something very human and something that we do even outside of software projects, right? Which is this natural need to organize ourselves, to set ourselves as a group, to do something, even if it's just passing time and having fun, right? And now, abstracting this from the individual and into our process of building software, right? And you might have additional steps here, you might have less steps here, but ideally, software development lifecycle is followed truly and strictly, right? And there are also places on the software development lifecycle where AI is valuable without the risk of losing agency, right? Without the risk of delegating something that is quite important, that if done wrong, it will destroy the application, right? And take this with a grain of salt, and especially with a grain of human in the loop, which I told you what is in a moment. Some of the specific places where I've seen AI tooling, AI agents, or even IDE automation, right, work a lot in projects. Like it's tasks that definitely a human will spend a day or two or three or a week, and AI will simply do it in a couple of minutes if you spend enough time creating the right input. Is setting up a project, right? I don't know for you, but for me, starting up a project is probably the hardest thing to do. Actually, starting anything is the hardest thing to do, but starting up a project is the hardest thing to do. And that's one of the biggest help zones that are safe to delegate to an automative tool. It doesn't need to be AI. right? We have had many tools that set projects for us for a while, right? Scaffolding tools and even frameworks that very opinionatedly tell you how to structure your code so you don't have any issue figuring out what the folder structure should be, what the service layout should be, right? On the same feeling or the same spirit of that boilerplate. Boilerplate. A CRUD, for instance, is one of those things that I tell you I will delegate to a junior developer, right? For them to obtain experience on it, of course, but mostly because I've written so many that it pains me a little bit to write it, right? But truths, given the context of a very well written database model, right? Or a very well written configuration file or description file for your data entities. That's one of the incredible usages of AI that I've seen. Still, at the very end of this, there's always a human reviewing the output, right? There's always an engineering human validating that that's what they would have written, right? And I think that's what actually adds value, right? When we write code, we either are force pushing through, right? Brute forcing, I mean, the creation of features, or we have a plan and we know what to write, and at the end, the code and the elegancy of it and the size of it, it's the same as we envisioned at the beginning of our process, right? And that second scenario where we're actually planning before coding, where we are thinking about the solution before writing a line of code. And you guys that do test-driven development are probably very familiar with this. It's where we want to be when using AI tooling, right? Because that will still retain the context and agency of the understanding of the application in our heads. The process still happens in our brains, right? We can still output that into a technical document for the rest of the team to understand, to share our understanding of it. But in the end, given that input, someone else or something else can write the code for you, right? The same happens for data transfer objects or data access objects, like the stuff that is written in a single way every single time, right? And most of your IDEs are probably already giving you a hand with that, creating getters and setters, that type of thing, right? Another big area of opportunity here, and I've seen it live as well on a couple of projects, is testing, right? I've seen both the scenarios where people are doing test-driven development, right? And just by writing the specification of the code, they let the AI write the tests for it, and then they personally manually implement the functionality against those tests, which one of the practices that we were talking about. And I also seen the other side, right, where people are writing features, are coding ideally with pure functions so it can be tested correctly, and then they let the agent write the unit tests, right? And again, at the end of every one of these processes, there's the human in the loop, reviewing, understanding what the output is, validating it, and reiterating, right, if it's not what it's expected. Finally, I have to say I love using AI for this. Documentation. How many of you, I know you can answer, but think it in your head, how many of you have walked into a project and that's probably bigger than any project that you've been before, and it has zero documentation or a very outdated documentation, right? The effort of getting into a new code base is usually a recon effort, right? You have to actually figure out what every system is every single time you join a project. And the way current large language models that are integrated with IDEs, right? If you're using Cursor or Say or Windsurf or any of the cool tools the cool kids are using today, you will notice that many of them have enough memory, enough context on their paid versions to understand your whole code base, right? And this has actually been a value for new customers, right? Understanding pieces of code base for new customers that even they didn't know were there, right? Whenever you work on projects that are large enough, even you as an engineer in that project, even you as someone who wrote pieces of that functionality, start forgetting pieces of it, right? When it's been a year that you're not coding on that anymore. So having an artifact that is aware of your code base context or your system context, if you're able to connect it to other pieces of your system, it's super useful. It's definitely a live documentation, the live documentation we've always wanted, right? It will leave that curator manager that I told you about without a job, of course, but again, it's where we're moving towards, right? Cutting off the menial tasks or the tasks that the effort and value aren't as equal, right? And delegating them to something that is probably doing a better job than us at static analysis and documentation producing. That's great. Now, We've talked about individual practices. We've talked about teams. Like how does it happen on teams? What have I seen teams do? And now this one is a set of practices that come out of, again, teams currently using AI during their processes, trying to use them responsibly as well. Holding meetings every week, which is part of the practices that I suggest, right? Holding meetings every week or every 2 weeks, probably every month is too long for this type of effort, where people just share what they've been doing, right? Where people share their findings and which prompts have they used, which errors have they found, which mishaps and successes have they encountered during a week of using AI tooling, whether it's just prompting directly into a chat or integrating with an MCP server, a bunch of tools in your domain locally, right? So some of these teams, they all echo almost the same practices, right? And one of them, as you've heard on the previous slide, reviewing before accepting, right? Most of the tooling nowadays has a rollback option. It always lets you decide, right? This is not about the functionality or the feature of the editor you're using. This is, again, more of the individual practice of reviewing the code that you write, that others write, and that an AI tool writes. And especially because AI tools in today's day and age can feel magical sometimes, even if you are technical and understand the mathematics behind it. Hence, it gives you a very easy way, right, of just solving things by asking them to be solved by the AI on the IDE, right? But that process skips a lot of hoops, right? It skips a lot of steps that are actually important for the cognitive process and the collaborative cognitive process of the team. Like understanding why am I doing this, understanding if I'm adding a new pattern, probably that we've agreed not to add, or that we are actually using the right patterns, right? One of the good benefits that we have today as well, now that we understand how AI and context collaborate, right, to make sure that they are retrieving the right information and producing the right information, is describing what you actually want, right? And this description isn't just a two-liner or a three-liner. The better you are at describing the system's requirements and the use cases, right, and the specific patterns that you want to use, and the better the output, definitely the better the output. It's exponentially better. And I usually have files that describe whole feature sets, right, or a very large file that I probably produce with another AI tool, a product owner AI tool that contains a very detailed, very broken down set of steps and requirements that I have for a system that I want to be created, right? The next activity, right, or the next action that comes from teams today using AI daily in a conscious and responsible manner is the one-time rewrite, right? Like, yes, let the AI write stuff for you, but if you're actually working on a feature that is critical for the business, right? Like, let's say you're working on the payments pipeline, right? Or you're working on the customer integration pipeline or the onboarding pipeline, you might want to write it yourself anyways, right? Regardless of the perfect output you get out of the AI tool, because that way you're actually internalizing the decisions, even if you didn't take them. It's sort of the same thing as when you're following a tutorial and you're just copy pasting code, which is, again, not ideal, but it's a process to learning, right? That many people use. And in this scenario, it's learning towards shared understanding of what we are doing and why we are doing things. The next one, which is probably the best that I've seen, or the highest value I've seen out of it, is pairing without AI, right? So teams agree between them to use AI at a certain degree, right? Like, let's use it for unit testing, let's use it for stuff. But when you use it for feature writing, right, they end up creating the pull request and then pair programming around it as without the AI, like two humans or more dialoguing and conversing about the decisions taken to complete a feature, right? And the reason I say this adds the most value is because, again, in the interactions, there's the real magic of producing software, right? When you are explaining something to another human, like rubber duck programming kind of thing, but you're getting real feedback from that human, right? Probably also a human that shares context of the product, of the code base, of the business needs with you. It usually outputs, or the outcome of it is usually a better understanding of the team, but also a better solution, right? A solution that has more eyes looking at it to see errors or optimizations usually will be better than one that is just observed by their creator, and even more so if their creator is an AI. And finally, a periodical skill checkpoint. This one I have just seen it on one of the teams that's been, I think, using AI tooling for a year now, right? And they've gotten to the point where they are feeling the skill erosion, right? So they set up a recurring call pretty much a monthly checkpoint where they talk about patterns, where they talk about technical decisions without any AI involved. This is mostly a casual conversation just to make sure that they are still in the loop, right? That they are still on their toes, that they are aware of the information they need to create the product they are creating, that they haven't lost any foundational awareness or knowledge that they need for them to complete it, right? And if you see a trend on this, again, it's interactions, right? It's going back to the human side of software development because code is cheap in the end. And finally, some sensible defaults and practices from my own experience working with AI, working with some teams that are using AI, right? And also from teams, from people and experts that I talked to this same week, right? The first advice is start prompting and prompt often and actually implement a culture of using prompts, right? Because it's a tool that's here to stay, first of all. It's not a tool we can fight against, at least not yet. Probably when we reach Terminator times, we will. But right now, it's something that we need to embrace, right? It's a tool that provides value in the end. So it's better to just figure out how to get the value out of it. And also, before moving into the show and tell, promote a culture of actively sharing your prompts, right? There's even now platforms like GitHub called Prompt Hub, where you do some version control around your prompts, right? Because prompts are not there only to be used between a human and a large language model. Usually prompts are the interface we decided as engineers, as an industry, to communicate with a large language model, right? A structured text, a structured language. So yeah, start sharing what your practice is, start sharing what works for you and what doesn't, and even start doing a code versioning repository, right? For your prompts, for the prompts that you're using for your CI/CD pipelines, if you want, the prompts that you're using for customer-oriented applications, right? How are they fetching information that customer support might find interesting? How are you using prompts specifically for the software development process, right? How do we ask specific things to the system to produce certain features on a certain format? And this might resonate a lot, again, with tools that we've already had for years, like scaffolders, like Geoman, like a lot exist out there, right? The benefit, of course, here is that with a tool driven by AI, like generative AI, you also have the context, enough context for it to produce something good. Now, the weekly show and tell, it's a practice that one of our teams that was given the task by their customer to produce most of their code with AI by the end of the year, is a weekly show and tell, right? Like every Friday, they religiously gather to talk about what they did with AI. And it can be simple things like, hey, I centered the diff, or it can be actually like, hey, I wrote the system, it got stuck here, I had to manually write this feature, but after that, it got unstuck and you could continue developing. Right now, on the stage that the technology is, and especially since it's evolving almost on a daily basis, sharing is caring, definitely. Education is quite important. Again, these are new tools. This is something that is being introduced into our environment, whether we want it or not, right? So education about the right usage will definitely prevent people not using that drill to put a hole through the TV, right, through their computer, but to use it properly for the right use cases and with the right boundaries, right? And finally, postmortems. I've seen some teams adding postmortem for problems that they had, for red teams that are figuring out a problem that happened, usually blameless postmortems, but with a factor of blame in AI, or like thinking if using AI drove us to this problem. And so far it hasn't, because most of the problems are DevOps related or customers clicking on a button too many times. But that's an interesting practice, right? Like understanding if something we just added is a factor of failure or success in our process. So getting into the closing remarks of the talk, the takeaways on this should be, we can use a tool like this to automate. It's not new to the industry to use a tool to automate tasks. But in this case, where the tool we are using can actually drain some of the skill from us if we allow it, we have to automate with intention, right? We have to carefully plan what we are actually using this tool for. We have to carefully review what the output is, right? And we also always have to have a human in the loop, right? A human in the loop at the very end. Also, and possibly this talk doesn't hit that point because most of my lists were kind of checklists, right? But enforcing those guardrails and practices through culture and team agreements instead of checklists, like I just said, it's a big part of it, right? In the end, we are humans adopting a new technology, a new artifact into our lives. And every change like that has some pains. It has a process. It has some steps that we have to go through as humans to really internalize something new in our lives, right? And as I mentioned, this is a tool. You can use it as a drill or a chainsaw. Use it responsibly. I'm pretty sure that will be the differentiator moving forward, right? Not just using the AI tool, not just having a copilot in your IDE, but really being intentional, being deliberate on our practice while we're using these tools, right? So finally, just a fun romantic quote that I found out there. That AI actually be the win in your sales. As I mentioned, it adds a lot of value. I'm already seeing a lot of value, a lot of speed in projects, right? A lot of time spent on valuable stuff rather than creating CRUDs and creating documentation. But we still need to make sure that we as humans are in control of the output and the decisions there. So that is the end of my presentation. And I'll leave you this quick reflection just to leave you an actionable item you can take away from this talk, and you can start practicing or implementing one of these practices with you or your teams. But the last thing I have to tell you is thank you very much for your attention. I think we got on time. I'm probably on time for a couple of questions. Thank you very much.